Following the Second Vatican Council, many Catholic churches were remodeled in what some have denounced as a Wreckovation, as classic Catholic ascetical elements were replaced. Purged were things like high altars, communion rails, the crucifix, other sacred art, tabernacles, choir lofts, and pews. And in their place were added felt banners, low ceilings, stackable chairs, usually placed in a semicircular arrangement, and a low, centrally placed table-shaped altar. Around this altar, the cassocked altar boys ringing consecration bells were replaced by liturgical dancers and clowns honking their noses. Under the pretext of terms like modernization and the infamous spirit of Vatican II, Catholic bishops and priests spent much money to strip the Catholic churches of their Catholic identity. And when the jackhammers and bulldozers were done smashing the altars and demolishing the sanctuaries, what was left were, essentially, barren copies of Protestant worship spaces. While the self-imposed nature of this effort was something new, the smashing of altars and purging of sacred art and iconography from churches was not. In this episode, I'll trek through the long history of movements which sought to empty Catholic churches of their artistic and religious heritage.
God bless America.
God love you. I want these to be my first words of greeting to you. They will be the concluding words on each broadcast.
I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president.
Annuncio optis Gaudium Magnum. Habemus Papam.
You've embarked on a Catholic history trek.
Many prelates who proposed the remodeling and reorientation of Catholic churches and the Mass after the Second Vatican Council pointed to the early Church as their reference for these changes. So I suppose we should start there. When the Church was persecuted and underground, she did not have magnificent cathedrals with spires reaching towards the heavens, nor a rich history of art and iconography. As covered in our episodes on the history of the Mass, the history of receiving Holy Communion, and the items used at the altar, episodes 33, 105, and 164, the holy sacrifice of the Mass was initially clandestine. Low-key, inconspicuous, and portable were essential aspects of the celebration, but not so much by intent as by necessity. And as soon as the legalization of Christianity came about in the early 4th century, the Church Fathers did not remain low-key and inconspicuous. Instead, they shifted to beautiful permanent structures, worthy of the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth. Their church buildings were based on the Roman Basilica, with high ceilings symbolically ascending to the heavens and a long, straight floor plan orienting the congregation towards the sanctuary, set apart from the rest of the church. And central in this sanctuary was the altar, where the priest celebrated the sacrifice of the Mass. These early churches were furnished with permanent stone altars and golden chalices and ciboriums, materials and designs which transcended any contemporary or humanistic ideals, and instead pointed to the eternal nature of Christ's atoning sacrifice on the cross. The walls of catacombs and house churches, which witnessed the earliest Catholic Masses, were decorated with religious art. And from this time forward, Catholics have placed their artistic genius to crafting mosaics, frescoes, and statuary to adorn their places of worship. Outside of sporadic raids which despoiled churches, such as the Visigoth sack of Rome in 410 and the Mohammedan attacks in the East and in the Iberian Peninsula, this trend of beautiful Catholic art and worship continued to be the practice of the Catholic Church, until the emergence of the iconoclast heresy in the 8th and 9th centuries. While Catholic tradition had always been favorable towards religious art, there had existed a small minority who opposed it as idolatry. And in the 8th century, several Eastern bishops held this view, most notably Bishop Constantine of Nicolia, who successfully turned Emperor Leo III to this position, which has been called iconoclasm, from the Greek word iconoklasmos, meaning image breaking. In 726, Emperor Leo III declared images were preventing the conversion of Jews and Muslims, were dividing his empire, and were opposed to the first commandment. So he published an edict commanding all images in churches be destroyed. Before long, the iconoclast heretics began to apply this principle to relics, and added the burning and destruction of the bodies of the saints to their itinerary. In several places, rebellions sprung up against the emperor's iconoclastic acts, but the edict was enacted with ruthless military force, and all opposition was crushed. Monks, who were the most steadfast opponents against iconoclasm, were especially targeted by the emperor. Monasteries were destroyed, and many monks were tortured, banished, and put to death. While all this was taking place in the East, in the West, sacred art found an ally in Pope Gregory II, who rebuffed the emperor's demands that he destroy the sacred art in Rome and call for a council to denounce its use. Instead, he sent letters to the emperor defending its use. His successor, Pope Gregory III, called for a council in Rome, but instead of denouncing sacred art, this council supported it and excommunicated those who destroyed, defiled, or removed any images of Christ, his mother, the apostles, or the other saints. When Emperor Leo III died in 741, his iconoclast mission was carried on by his son, Emperor Constantine V, who was even more zealously aligned with the heresy than his father. In 754, Constantine V summoned a synod at Constantinople, where he instructed the 300 Eastern bishops in attendance to carry out his war against icons. Images of Christ and the saints were forbidden. So too was invoking the saints and venerating their relics, which were exhumed and dumped into the sea. In Eastern churches, nature scenes, pictures of flowers, fruits, and birds replaced the religious art, which led some to comment the churches looked more like grocery stores and bird shops than places set aside for the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The monks continued to receive the brunt of imperial persecution. Constantine forbid the wearing of monastic habits and even attempted to abolish the practice of monasticism. In 755, Constantine died and was replaced by his son, Leo IV, who took a milder stance against icons, although the iconoclast laws remained on the books and continued to be enforced. But when Emperor Leo IV suddenly died in 780, his wife, the Empress Irene, became the regent for their 9-year-old son, Constantine VI. And Empress Irene immediately set about undoing the work of her husband and his predecessors. Images and relics were restored to the churches, monasteries were reopened, and with Rome's approval, the Second Council of Nicaea was opened, which defended icons for veneration. Interestingly, the iconoclast heresy would spring up anew 27 years later, with a string of emperors enforcing it, until another empress, Empress Theodora, brought it to a close while serving as the regent for her 3-year-old son, the future emperor Michael III. While the heresy of iconoclasm in the 8th and 9th centuries was predominant in the East, it largely untouched the West, aside from a few isolated cases. But that would change with the rise of the Protestant heresy, when Christians would again wage war on sacred art. While Martin Luther was not necessarily an iconoclast, other Protestant leaders, especially Ulrich Zwingli, were. And as Protestants gained political power in the West, they inspired a new wave of iconoclasm. Perhaps the most infamous events within Protestant iconoclasm would be the dissolution of the monasteries in England and the Beeldenstorm in the Netherlands. The dissolution of the monasteries stripped Catholic churches and monasteries bare, although this plundering of Catholic churches by Protestant nobility was more motivated by greed than theology, and the art wasn't smashed, but simply stolen and resold. The Beeldenstorm of 1566, on the other hand, was purely ideological. As mentioned in episode 145, The Martyrs of Horkham, Dutch Calvinists stirred up mob violence to destroy Catholic churches, altars, windows, statues, shrines, artworks, relics, and sacred vessels. Basically anything of value. Anything Catholic. In the following centuries, as Protestantism gave way to less religious forms of humanism and liberalism, the ensuing Masonic anti-clerical governments enacted their own waves of iconoclasm. Of these, perhaps the French Revolution is the most notable, which not only attacked Catholic church buildings and art, but also Catholic clergy and religious. The next logical step in liberalism was the emergence of communism, which continued and elevated the war against God and any art which pointed to him. As calendars turned to the 20th century, government-sponsored purging of religious art continued with events like the October Revolution in the early part of the century in Russia and the communist takeover of China in the mid-20th century. We've even seen recent iconoclastic attacks on Catholic churches in America. In the summer of 2020, when the BLM and Antifa riots burned cities and destroyed statues of U.S. presidents, abolitionists, and Christopher Columbus, statues of both Jesus and Mary were among those toppled and decapitated. Since that time onward, some have counted up to 400 acts of arson and vandalism against Catholic churches' art and property, symbolically attacking the Catholic faith by destroying sacred art. These attacks on Catholic churches and art were all external, committed by heretics and those opposed to the Catholic Church. But following the close of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, these attacks began to emerge from within, with many priests and bishops having high altars smashed with jackhammers, removing tabernacles from the sanctuary, whitewashing or replacing sacred art with modern nature scenes and abstract images, and sending communion rails and church pews to the scrap heap. All this was done in the name of, or the spirit of, the council. But what did the council actually say? The only document issued by the Second Vatican Council related to this topic was Sacrosanctum Concilium. In Chapter 7, on sacred art and sacred furnishings, we find the following guidelines. Sacred art set apart for divine worship should be truly worthy and beautiful. Bishops should remove art from churches which is repugnant to Christian piety and faith and is of mediocre artistic worth. Sacred images must be retained in churches, but not be overbearing. The history of sacred art collected over the centuries must be carefully preserved. So there's no mention of redecorating churches or purging beautiful art and architecture. Instead, it says the opposite. Despite the Second Vatican Council giving no directive to remodel churches or eliminate sacred art, this effort continued unabated, often under the guise of following the council and implementing Pope Paul VI's new Mass, the Novus Ordo Missae. But this remodeling does not seem to have been the intent of the council or of the Holy Father, since the Vatican issued a letter in 1971 ordering the Wreckovating of churches to be stopped. This letter, Opera Artis, was released by the Congregation for the Clergy on the care of the Church's historical and artistic heritage. To quote a few lines from this letter, "It grieves the faithful to see that more than ever before there is so much unlawful transferal of ownership of the historical and artistic heritage of the Church, as well as theft, confiscation, and destruction. Disregarding the warnings and legislation of the Holy See, many people have made unwarranted changes in places of worship under the pretext of carrying out the reform of the liturgy and have thus caused the disfigurement or loss of priceless works of art. In commissioning artists and choosing works of art that have become part of the Church, the highest artistic standard is to be set. Works of art from the past are always and everywhere to be preserved. Precious objects, especially votive offerings, are not to be disposed of without permission of the Holy See." While the document clearly prohibited the unwarranted remodeling of churches and scrapping sacred art in favor of bland, banal work, the iconoclastic purging continued. Meanwhile, in the Protestant world, church architecture was also trending in the direction of plain, bland worship spaces, with Protestant architect Anders Sovik as perhaps the most celebrated or notorious name in that field. His 1973 book, Architecture for Worship, highlighted the shift in church art and architecture. His book promoted the non-church, in other words, a church building that would be designed to fulfill both liturgical and non-liturgical uses. To accomplish this ideal, new church buildings had to be built and existing ones remodeled with the following design considerations. Avoid the use of pews. Instead, use portable, preferably stackable chairs. Minimize art, and avoid any statues or images which are strictly religious. Instead of a crucifix, use the Greek cross, which is essentially a plus sign, devoid of any strong religious association. The focal point of a church should not be an altar and not be a tabernacle. Instead, the space should feel like a gathering space, focused on those gathered. If an altar is to be used, its significance should be diminished. So it should be shaped like a table, and instead of placing it in a place of prominence, it should be lowered and placed in the midst of the congregation with chairs around it. And in Catholic churches which reserve the Eucharist, the tabernacle should be in a separate room, away from the main body of the church. Because the goal was not to have a church built specifically for the worship of God, but to have a gathering space which could also serve as a worship space, along with a myriad of other uses. For any listeners who are sports fans, this utilitarian design focus may sound similar, as it was all the rage for the many multi-purpose stadiums built in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which were used by both professional baseball and professional football teams. Among them would be Shea Stadium, the Astrodome, Fulton County Stadium, Riverfront Stadium, Three Rivers Stadium, Veterans Stadium, and the Kingdome. These utilitarian stadiums were regularly considered the ugliest in professional sports, and I believe most of them have since been demolished and replaced with single-use stadiums designed to enhance the fans' experience at the ballpark. Sovek's book, Architecture for Worship, was highly influential in both Protestant and Catholic circles, and as church construction followed the population out to the suburbs, more barren, utilitarian Catholic churches began to spring up, and existing urban churches were remodeled to match this vision of the non-church. Sacrosanctum Concilium and Opera Artis did little to slow the spread of unwarranted church renovation. From the late 1950s up to the early 1970s, the American bishops built over a dozen new cathedrals, each embodying the spirit of the barren non-church that embraced the modern iconoclasm. Particularly of note would be the cathedrals of the Epiphany in Venice, Florida, Risen Christ in Lincoln, St. Jude the Apostle in St. Petersburg, St. Joseph in Jefferson City, and St. Mary of the Assumption in San Francisco. In 1977, following this building spree of iconoclastic cathedrals, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a document titled Environment and Art in Catholic Worship, or the EACW for short. The EACW borrowed heavily from Sovek's anti-liturgical iconoclastic ideals. Reading through the bishop's document, one finds the same sentiments championed by Sovek, such as chairs are preferable to pews, church buildings should not be artistically impressive, churches should feel like a community social gathering, the seating should allow the congregation to see and pay attention to each other during the liturgy. Ideally, the altar should be a small, simple table. Provisions should be made for screens or for walls to accommodate the projecting of films and slides for the entire assembly to watch. A plus sign shaped cross is preferable to a crucifix, and this plus sign shaped cross should not be permanent in the church, but should only be a processional cross that can be removed after the liturgy. The EACW further added, many existing churches are unsuitable for the modern Mass, and the modern liturgical renewal involves the rejection of art and architectural features which are deemed to be a hindrance to the modern Mass. And the EACW pointed out this effort will result in austere interiors with barren walls. Duncan Strowick, a professor of architecture at Notre Dame, described the EACW in an article from the Sacred Architecture Journal as a document of architectural reductionism that reflects a liturgical reductionism. It's fearful of symbols, history, art, and even architecture. And rather than draw on the rich Roman Catholic tradition, its aesthetics seem to be limited to modernist architecture of the 1960s, which gives us a vision of church architecture which is a large living room replete with plants and banners. In the face of opposition to these extreme design changes, the U.S. bishops have since pointed out that while the EACW was crafted to provide guiding principles for church reckovating, it was never presented to or approved by the body of bishops, and therefore did not carry any force of law behind it. Despite its non-authoritative nature, the EACW was referenced frequently by designers of Catholic churches in the subsequent decades. And when the U.S. bishops released a follow-up document in the year 2000 titled Built of Living Stones, many of the EACW's design elements were preserved. The first official document with any weight behind it from the bishops on art and architecture came a couple years later, when the English translation of the General Instruction of the Roman Missal was approved in 2002. Chapter 5, on the arrangement of furnishings of churches, provides a step back from some of the more radical changes called for in the bishop's earlier documents, and from what has been implemented in many churches over the past half-century. The General Instruction, or GERM as it's often called, states, "Sacred buildings should be truly beautiful and signs of heavenly realities. The sanctuary should be appropriately marked off from the body of the church. The altar should occupy a place where it is the center of attention. When an existing high altar cannot be adapted for the new Mass, and the only way to remove it is to destroy it, it should be left intact. Seating should be arranged in new churches so the faithful can take up the bodily postures required for the parts of the Mass. The choir should be positioned with the assembled community so they can participate in the Mass. In accordance with the most ancient tradition of the Church, images of the Lord, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and other saints should be displayed for veneration." So the germ seems to imply no ugly modernist churches, no altar and sanctuary mixed in with the congregation, the kneelers should be kept for kneeling, the choir should be at the congregation and not up in the sanctuary, and religious statues and art should not be removed. Although one holdover from the bishop's earlier documents, which made its way into the germ, was the removal of the tabernacle. The germ instructs that the tabernacle should be taken away from the altar where Mass is celebrated, and even recommends that Jesus be entirely removed from the main body of the church and placed in a separate chapel. With modern churches becoming barren to better adapt them for the modern Mass, as explained in the Bishop's Guideline, Environment and Art in Catholic Worship, it's difficult not to ponder if the bishops were implying there is a corresponding theological emptiness to the modern Mass. Whether or not that was their intention, many have pointed out how the remodeled churches forcibly changed the focus of Catholic liturgy from a vertical worship towards God to a horizontal worship towards man. Author Michael S. Rose commented in his book Ugly as Sin, "Ever since Christians have established holy places for sacred worship, there have been those who either sought to destroy these houses of God or convert them to pagan or secular purposes. To that end, ever since Kevin and I began Catholic History Trek, there have been algorithms who sought to suppress our content due to a lack of listens and ratings. To help prevent Catholic History Trek from becoming remodeled into a barren podcast devoid of any content, we would appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe, share it with a friend, and leave a rating. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Sicut erat in principio nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen."
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.